Hi, everyone. So, I'd like to talk a little bit about Star Wars today. So, here we go.
Here's how episode 9 can fix the Last Jedi. Ideas from Impel to comment.
And by the way, of course, there are going to be spoilers in this clip, so plan accordingly. So, I guess that I'm in the minority because I really liked The Force Awakens, but I did not like The Last Jedi. A lot of people, at least online, have said that they either liked both or hated both. I think they're really two very different movies in terms of tone and other things. So I looked at some of the criticism, and of course, there's a lot of praise for The Last Jedi also. But some of the criticism was about the main plot line, and there I have to agree. It really wasn't a very compelling or original storyline for one of supposedly the last movies of this franchise. The idea that the Empire could track the rebels through hyperspace is kind of a copy of that famous Battlestar Galactica episode, though Battlestar Galactica, frankly, did it much better than Star Wars did. It was more intense, more riveting. Um, Also, the premise was that the rebels were running out of fuel, so they couldn't jump into hyperspace. But there was never an indication that the Empire was out of fuel, so they probably could have just have jumped ahead themselves and cut off the path of the rebels. So that was one thing. Another criticism is a sort of social one that all of the women were strong characters and the men were all either emasculated or broken. Everyone's going to hate me because this is the internet, but I tend to find most of those anti SJW commentary on our culture stuff boring and overblown. And it really didn't bother me in this movie. There's a legitimate reason that Rey needs to be female, as I can show below, and kind of semi-legitimate reason that she's so powerful. Mary Sue, I think they call it, even without any training or anything. The franchise needed a new young star to take over and be a foil against the entire dark side. Even Luke and Obi-Wan, with all their training, couldn't do that, so it makes some sense to have some freakish dynamo kind of come out of nowhere that might just be more naturally powerful than any other person that we've seen in the galaxy. And there's obviously, of course, a reason that a woman is leading the rebellion. It's not because she's a woman, it's because it's Princess Leia, and that's a giant selling point for the whole trilogy. So that one I really don't buy. Here are my two major criticisms. One is that they tried to force a bunch of things into this movie that were either out of place or extraneous. Of course, the entire casino thing is fairly extraneous, as is the whole mutiny thing with Poe, as is the scene with the thousand different rays in the cave. Um, there's also a bunch of extraneous famous actors. Laura Dern's role, I think, could have been cut out totally. Benicio del Toro looked like he might be an interesting character, but he really isn't. It would have been so much better if they had put Lando Calrissian into that role, like an 80-year-old Billy D. Williams is suddenly there in the next cell. That would have been amazing. And then it had him betray the rebels again, just because that was his nature. Those scenes, that plot twist would have been incredible. But no. And then Gwendolyn Christie was so invisible in this movie that I forgot she was in it until her final scene, because Phasma has no personality. She has no development. There's no intrigue. She's basically just a tall, unpleasant stormtrooper. So she could have been cut as well. And then there were 5 different sets of animals that were only in the movie either for comic relief or marketing. And then they also tried to force a bunch of humor into the script, which almost never seemed organic. I particularly disliked Luke brushing the bullets off of his shoulder. I thought that was really out of place for how he would react. He also, him tickling Rey's hand while she was trying to study the Force, that's also not like him. The prank call at the beginning seemed out of place. And then one-liners, I think Finn called Phasma Chrome Dome. That seems a lot more like a Marvel Comics kind of thing than Star Wars. And it seemed like they should have stuck to maybe 5 total elements, but they had like 15 and they put everything in. And so I think it kind of came out as a mess. And then the second criticism is that almost all of the characters are boring. Like, we know one thing about Finn in 2 movies now, which is that he defected from the First Order. There's no compelling other reason to root for him. General Eric Trump here is not a compelling villain. He just shouts and stews, and that's it. And speaking of non-compelling villains, I already mentioned Phasma, but there could have been just so much more about Snoke. Was he the son of some previous villain? Was he the stitched-together corpse of someone? How did he get so much power? Why does he hate the rebels so much? What were his plans if the First Order, like, won and took over everything? But no, he just kind of dies immediately. It's not really even all that dramatic. So there's no development for Snoke. There's no backstory about Rey, because we find out that her parents are nobodies. Poe just seems like a typical hotshot pilot, kind of a lesser version of Han. There's no real development either. And then even Leia doesn't really ever give a rousing speech. She doesn't lead people into battle. She doesn't do anything that interesting other than the floating in that one scene. There's nothing that compelling about her character in this movie. On top of this, there really are no stakes. We never get a sense of why the rebellion getting smaller and smaller actually affects anything, because we've seen now for 8 movies, they always seem to be able to thwart whatever the Empire does regardless. So when all of the major characters remain alive, and I know Luke dies, but they can bring him back as a ghost if they need to, just seems as though nothing really changes from one battle to the next, and that gets a little monotonous. So those are my criticisms. I think a lot of this can be solved in Episode 9, and with J.J. Abrams back to direct it, I hope that it goes back in the right direction. And there are some things from The Last Jedi that can be used in making a really interesting final story. So here is my story. All right, we start at Princess Leia's funeral. So there's a big opportunity to give her a nice emotional farewell. What did she die of? It doesn't matter to me. Maybe some ambush that they reference, maybe a broken heart because of Luke, whatever. Poe is named the new leader of the rebellion, and he's informed that there's this planet they had never discovered, and it has a bank on it, and the bank gives almost all of the funding to the First Order. And if they can destroy the bank, they'll basically permanently cripple the Empire financially, and then they can win once and for all. And this is the way that they're able to tie in that weird segment about capitalism from the last movie, the sort of showing of the different ships. I did think that was out of place, by the way, since usually the motivating factor in this war is either power or freedom or the Jedi religion stuff. It's not usually about money. But there are some money concerns in Star Wars throughout the years. The whole Jabba the Hutt plotline, for example, was about money. But anyway, so not only does that tie that part of The Last Jedi into the story and make it no longer extraneous, it actually becomes relevant now. It actually is a structural way to end something, because otherwise they'll just keep rebuilding, both sides, or at least one side will. Because we just saw them have nothing at the end of Return of the Jedi. The Empire was totally wiped out. And they just built it all the way back to this. If you can actually dry up the funding source, then that is a real way to actually get closure. So Poe learns that there are thousands of people around the galaxy, that signal thing that they sent out at the end of The Last Jedi. They're willing to have this one last fight against the Empire. They're going to take out the bank, and then somehow they'll defeat the Empire's army. And that's the plan. That becomes the plan for the movie. Of course, the Empire hears about this, and they know that they're in huge trouble if they lose this bank, so they decide to put all of their forces into this one final battle. Meanwhile, Rey and Kylo continue to try to convince each other to join one another's side, and they can each intuit that this final war that they hear about is going to totally destroy the galaxy. It's going to be so bloody, so evenly matched, that basically everyone's going to die on both sides, and neither of them want this to happen. And so they have this intense mind battle. Kylo says, just let the dark side win. We'll rule the galaxy together. We'll tell the rebels to surrender. Rey says, I don't trust the dark side. Just tell General Hux to stand down. You're the leader now. Kylo says, there's no light side. It can never hold. Everyone has some darkness inside of them. Eventually that always takes over. Just sort of back and forth like that. They try to reason with each other. They try to trick each other. They try to outwit each other. they try to outwill each other. They like just sort of by the force of the Jedi mind, and they become more and more frustrated as the battle escalates around them. And finally, it just boils over in rage, and we have this final badass super lightsaber battle between them. This is the last one of the franchise, and this is like a great 7-minute scene. They fight to a tie. Neither of them can win. They're completely evenly matched, and they're both just exhausted at the end on the ground. And then they kiss each other. I remember there was that one little scene in The Last Jedi where Kylo had his shirt off and Rey was flustered by him. That's an indication in a Disney movie that they're going to kiss eventually. That's what that means. And so they realize they're in love with each other, and then they figure out that the only way to have peace is to have an equal balance between light and dark. And that was the point of Luke's training, sort of. It was about balance in the universe. And so they decide they have to get both sides to surrender at the same time. And so that's the only way that anybody can win, is that nobody wins, and they restore balance to the universe. And they decide, okay, the First Order will release the stormtroopers to go back to their previous lives, and there'll be a truce that extends throughout the galaxy. So Rey goes with this plan to Poe, and Poe rejects it. He says, they've killed too many of my friends. We're all prepared to die for this cause. Leia would never have accepted a truce. You're just betraying her memory, and you are now a traitor to this cause. They have a falling out. And then Finn and Rose are caught in the middle between Poe and Rey fighting, which actually gives their characters, Finn and Rose, something mildly interesting to do. So that kind of solves a little bit of that. Meanwhile, of course, General Hux rejects the plan also, and of course it's his own stormtrooper army, so he decides to declare war against Kylo Ren. And I don't know how they would, exactly take care of that, but so he is declared a traitor to the Empire. And so the end of the movie is basically Rey and Kylo Ren fighting together, just like they did in Snoke's red place there in The Last Jedi. And Rey has to hold off the rebellion's attack against the bank, and Kylo has to hold off the Empire's retaliation against that attack. And so they end up fighting with one another against both sides. Eventually, I think the bank does get destroyed, but in the process, Hux gets killed, and all of the main stormtrooper generals are killed, and then that sort of releases the rest of the stormtrooper army to defect. And this ends the war. There's really no... you're not going to have a battle in which these two people defeat like 1 million soldiers, but that is a way in which you can have just the top of the mountain cave in, and that destroys the rest of it. And so the movie could end with Rey and Kylo kind of ruling the galaxy in a balanced way from then on. Or maybe there are no more rulers. We just end up with all the planets being kind of left alone in peace. Or a third option is that Rey and Kylo have a baby, and then that baby, and by the way, that's important. That's an important reason why she can't be Luke's daughter, because that would, and so that baby is the actual chosen one, the one that they were talking about in the prequels. And then the chosen one baby magically ushers in a new era of global peace. And then the child can look over into the darkness in the last minute and see the whole cast of his ghost ancestors, Ghost Luke, Ghost Leia, Ghost Han maybe, I don't know, Ghost Anakin, of course, could be there. Here's Ghost Natalie Portman, why not? And that's a nice way in which they could wrap everything up. Or they could end with Mala and Lumpy, and they're celebrating Life Day on Kashyyyk. That'd be quite a twist, right? So leave your comments about my idea, and if you think that this would make a good movie based upon the material that we have after The Last Jedi. Let me know if you think differently about The Last Jedi, if these elements returned in Episode 9, and let me know if you have a better idea of how this how this franchise could end. And of course, I'm sure some people will say it could end by just throwing the whole thing in the garbage. But if anybody actually has a really good idea for what would make a good plot, then I'd love to hear it. Thanks for listening.